I am one of more than 200 news reporters covering this case in this pleasant-looking little town of Somerville in the heart of Old New Jersey. The defendants are said to have shot to death Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills. That was on September 14th, 1922. 2 days later, the bodies of Mr. Hall, the rector of the St. John the Evangelist Episcopal Church in New Brunswick, New Jersey, and Mrs. Mills, a married choir singer in his congregation, were found in a lover's lane, side by side near a crabapple tree with bullet holes in them. It has been 4 years since that heinous double murder occurred. The legal representatives of the people of the state of New Jersey think they have the answer in this proud woman, Frances Hall, and her 2 brothers, and in the romance between the dead minister and the dead choir singer. But they have to prove to the satisfaction of the jury and a large number of the citizens of New Jersey, for the defendants have friends, and the dead tell no tales. It is on the stories of the living that the state relies, among them the testimony of the former circus rider, Mrs. Jane Gibson, called the Pig Woman, who claimed she saw the sinister little group beneath the crabapple tree the night of the murder, while riding on her mule in search of corn thieves. She is one of the weirdest characters in all the weird cast that has assembled here for this mystery play, The Trial of the Century. Let me introduce the main characters to you. Frances Noel Stevens Hall was married to Reverend Edward Hall. She is 9 years older than he. She and her brothers come from a prominent family that has ties to the Johnson & Johnson Company. Her demeanor and clothing suggest what she is, a wealthy widow. Her brother, William Stevens, lived with her and Reverend Hall in the Stevens family mansion, located at 23 Nichols Avenue in New Brunswick. They say that Willie is not all there mentally. He loves to hang out in firehouses. The widow's other brother, Henry Stevens, is said to be the man the state expects to prove fired the shots. He looks like a doctor, and his face generally maintains a stern, implacable expression. State Senator Alexander Simpson from Hudson County is the chief prosecutor. He's a small, jockey-sized, fox terrier little man with a wheedling voice. You can call it personality. This bulldog-looking man is Robert McCarter, the chief of the so-called $1 Million Defense Team. A former Attorney General of the state of New Jersey, he is an oldish, ruddy man with a firm mouth. There's obviously no love lost between Counselors Simpson and McCarter, as you will soon find out.
Hear ye, hear ye! All persons having business with the Court of Ox and the Terminator for the County of Somerset, roll not, and ye shall be heard. God bless this honorable court and the state of New Jersey.
That is Charles W. Parker, a justice of the New Jersey Supreme Court. He is a gray man who wears glasses, takes many notes, and decides all questions of law. Let's listen to Prosecutor Simpson as he gives his opening statement on behalf of the state.
Your Honor, just before we get proceeding, the courtroom is extremely hot today. Would it be possible for counsel and I perhaps not to have our jacket?
You may remove your jackets, gentlemen.
Thank you.
May it please the court and gentlemen of the jury. These 3 defendants have been indicted for the murder of Eleanor Mills on the 14th day of September, 1922, which occurred in your county, Somerset County. This murder is more than 4 years old, so that you may not expect some of the witnesses to remember everything clearly. You must expect some of the witnesses honestly to have bad memories. Some of them may not remember at all. They may assume. Now, the murder of Eleanor Mills was a gruesome murder. She was shot 3 times in the head and her throat was cut. Alongside of her was a man that had been murdered before she was murdered. This Eleanor Mills was a woman in humble circumstances. She went up to a church where there was this minister or pastor, the Reverend Edward Hall, and he was a very fine-looking man. He had married a woman considerably older than himself. Now then, you have these 2 people, this woman who was in church work and this minister, who did not seem to be satisfied with his home life, together in the church, and insensibly they began to grow together. The result was that between them, there became an intimacy that was not spiritual. You will hear the letters read, and it went on for a long time, and they got bold, very bold. The thing was open and notorious. Everybody knew it, and Mrs. Hall knew it. Mrs. Hall was a strong, proud woman, wounded perhaps as much in her pride as in her affections. And so this thing kept on and kept on. We will be able to prove to you that certain people spied on these two and carried the reports back to Mrs. Hall continually. Mrs. Hall got possession of the love letters, which could have left no doubt in her mind as to what was going on between her husband and this woman. On the day of the murder, she overheard a telephone conversation between Mrs. Mills and her husband. We know she communicated with her brother Henry, who was a sane man, but a stern man, and with her brother William, who, to be polite, was erratic. And she went out of the house to catch these two people together to confront them. And she took the letters so that when he told her that she would have the letters to confront them. There was a farm woman, and she went up to the lane. She saw the defendant, Francis Hall, and the defendant, William Stevens, in the lane near Easton Avenue. She got to a point known as the crabapple tree, and she heard men fighting. And as I remember it, said one man something like, "Goddamn, you let go of me, let go of me." And there was a flashlight flashing around there. And in the flashlight, she saw the face of this man, Harry Stevens, who seemed to be moving. Right after the man said, "Goddamn you," this shot went off. And then as she was riding away, 3 more shots went off. When she returned to the scene sometime later that night, she saw Mrs. Hall on her knees crying. Now then, we have other evidence which we will develop in time. You have to rely upon the sworn statements. We will attempt to prove these facts to you. You may draw guilt, you may draw innocence, but surely you have to draw the conclusion that with this evidence, it is perfectly right, indeed, it would be wrong not to put these defendants on trial. The indictment, as I said to you earlier, is for the murder of Eleanor Mills. I call Charlotte Mills as a witness.
I was 16 when my mother was murdered. We were very close. On the night she was killed, she told me after dinner she was going down to put a newspaper clipping on Reverend Hall's desk in the church. It was an article by Dr. Percy Stickney Grant of his church on the divorce question. That night, she went to St. John's around 7 p.m. to drop off the clipping. She came home, got a nickel to make a phone call, and she left home around 7:20. That was the last time I saw her. My mother was very active in church affairs. She sang in the choir, and she had done so for many years. Mother was fond of Reverend Hall. He generally came to our house about twice a month, sometimes in the afternoon. Dr. Hall and my mother would exchange notes by leaving them in a book in the study of the church. After they were murdered, I came across those notes and a diary of Dr. Hall, which Mother had placed in a bag in her house. Father sold them to the newspapers for $500. It's a shame. She wrote her last letter to Dr. Hall on the afternoon she was murdered.
I know there are girls with more shapely bodies, but I do not care what they have. I have the greatest of all blessings, a noble man, deep, true, and eternal love. Never will I say you want my body rather than me, what I really am. I know that if you love me, you will long and ache for my body.
Dearest, will these days ever pass? Each one seems weeks long. How I long to be with you again, clasp you to me, kiss you all over, talk to you, and just look at you and dream wonders.
I could fling my arms about you and pour kisses on my babykin's head and face.
I want to fondle and caress you so much. I want to hold you close in my arms and know you're safe and happy and warm. Dearest, we were meant for each other's arms. That is our heaven.
Honey, do you suppose we could start early in the morning and not return until the following night late, say 10 or 11? Darling, do you yearn for it as I do?
My own dear Wonderheart, it seems as though we have together opened the doors of a wonderful world. Intangible, and yet eternal it is. We know it, and it is ours forever.
I am on my knees, darling, looking up at my noble man, worshiping, adoring. Oh, honey, I am fiery today, burning, flaming love.
But to see you anyway, and to hold you, crush you, and pour my burning kisses on your dear body, and to look deep into those wonderful eyes of love. I love you more than words can tell, and my every prayer is for the divinest blessings for you.
You are a true priest, born for it. I am merely your physical inspiration.
Dearest, love me hard, harder than ever, for your babykins is longing for his mother.
Sweetheart, my true heart, I could crush you. Oh, I am wild tonight. Darling, my life is nothing except I have all your love. I am holding my sweet babykin's face in my hands and looking deep into his heart.
How fierce I am, loving you, and so deeply and truly, a long, strong, burning kiss on your lips, liquid fire into your very soul.
September 14th, 1922. You are a true priest. I am merely your physical inspiration. Do I love you too much? I know now I could leave, now, yes, even your physical presence, and go into a convent. There, I wouldn't see anyone touch you, call you dear, rub your tired body, sew your torn trousers. Yesterday, I was happy in a way, in the boat and in the water. But on the way home, I was thinking hard. Oh, my darling babykins, what a muddle we are in. But I will be content. I will.
The state calls Edward Garrigan to the witness stand.
Please remove your hat.
Sir, Your Honor. I'm a police officer with the City of New Brunswick. I was dispatched to DeRussie's Lane, arriving there about 10:45 in the morning, September 16th, 1922. There I met Pearl Balmer, 15 years old, and Raymond Schneider, a 22-year-old married man. They were picking mushrooms in the area, or so they say, when they discovered two bodies lying by a crabapple tree off of Lover's Lane near the Phillips farm. The bodies were Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills. They were lying face up. Mrs. Mills' head was resting on Mr. Hall's right arm. They were laid out perfectly. The clothes were not disarrayed in any way, and there were some letters torn up lying between them. Mr. Hall's calling card was placed standing up near his left foot. His Panama hat was placed over his face. There was a mass of maggots from ear to ear on the woman's throat. By the time I left the scene, some officials from Somerset County had arrived, and Mr. Cardinal, a reporter for the Home News newspaper, was there as well.
The state calls Ralph Grorslein to the witness stand.
I knew Eleanor Mills. She was a pretty woman who sang in the choir with me at St. John's Episcopal Church in New Brunswick. I also knew Minnie Clark, another member of the church who thought highly of the Reverend Hall. 4 years ago, I told the investigators that on the evening of the murders, I had driven with Miss Catherine Rostall home at 10 p.m. that night from the movie theater in New Brunswick. What I failed to mention then, and I testified to now, was that I had driven her to DeRussey's Lane first, where we parked with the car lights off. I didn't want people to think ill of her then. Did I mention that I'm married and she's not? Anyway, when we were parked there, I heard a shot and a woman moan. Then I heard 3 shots in quick succession and more moaning. This all happened around 10:15 p.m. Shortly thereafter, we left and I drove her home.
I call George Totten to the witness stand.
I'm a detective with the Somerset County's Prosecutor's Office. September 16th, 1922, I was at the scene of the crime with Sheriff Robert Conklin. I saw the bodies lying on their backs. The lady was to the right of the gentleman. The gentleman's right hand was extended partly under the lady's shoulders and neck. The eyeglasses were on. I observed from under the rim of the hat that his eyeglasses were spotted. There were letters and cards lying on the ground between the 2 bodies. The lady's hat lay off to her right. On the ground, a scarf partly around the lady's neck. There was a wound in the lady's neck, which was entirely filled up with worms. Maggots, you might call them. I also observed letters and cards lying on the ground between the bodies from the waist down to the feet. Near the man's left foot, there was a calling card. It had blood spots on it and stood up on the edge. When Sheriff Conklin and I left with the evidence, I put the exhibits, cards, folders, and letters in our office here in the courthouse. The calling card was eventually taken to Middlesex County. At the time it was taken from the crabapple tree, there were no black marks or smudges on there, such as appear now. Otherwise, it is the same, except, of course, there are fly specks still on it, which are not as prominent now as they were at the time it was picked up. The last time I saw it before recently was in the hands of Mr. Fitzpatrick, the fingerprint expert of Middlesex County.
I call Joseph Barreau to the witness stand.
I have 26 years of experience in testifying as an expert in the science of fingerprinting criminals. I studied the field in London and Paris. I have examined the state's exhibit S-17, Reverend Hall's calling card found at the scene of the crime. It is my expert opinion that the print on the back of the card is that of the left index finger of William Stevens. Only 5% of the human race have this type of fingerprint.
At this time, the prosecutor interrupted his direct examination to address the court about one of his witnesses, Jane Gibson, also known as Jane Easton. She had been in court the day before but became ill and was taken to the hospital. Mr. Simpson sent for her to testify, but her doctor refused to allow her to leave the hospital, stating that she might go into a coma because of her condition. Simpson was adamant about having the pig woman, as she was referred to by us reporters because she owned a pig farm near the site of the murders, testify and requested that the court and jury go to the hospital and take her testimony there. After the recess that day, the judge did in fact go and see her in the hospital, but declined Simpson's request that she testify from the hospital. She would make a dramatic appearance in court later in the trial.
Hadn't you better excuse this witness till tomorrow?
Yes, that is all, Commissioner. Come back tomorrow. I call James Mills to the witness stand. Mr. Mills, where do you live?
49 Carmen Street, New Brunswick, New Jersey.
And how old are you?
48.
Was Eleanor Mills, who was murdered on the 14th of September, between 10 and half past 10 at night, 1922, your wife?
Yes, sir.
And how old was she when she died?
She was about 34.
And when were you married to her?
I was married in 1905.
And did you and she have any children?
Yes, Charlotte, now 20, and Daniel, now 16.
Was your wife connected with the St. John Episcopal Church all the time that Reverend Hall was the rector?
Yes.
And during the last year of her life, was she a constant attendant at church, at choir?
Yes.
And were you the sexton at the church?
Yes. For about 2 years.
And what did you do at the church?
I looked after the fires in the winter, cleaned outside the building, cut grass and things like that. But I had nothing to do with the inside cleaning, though. I didn't do any cleaning in the church. We had 2 women to do that.
Did you know any persons who had keys that would admit them to the church edifice, Sunday school, rooms, or anywhere else in the church?
Yes, there were 5 keys.
And who had them?
Well, Mr. Hall had one, Mrs. Storr, the organist, had one, Mrs. Minna Clark had one, I had one, and my wife had one.
Did you go to church on Friday morning, September 15, 1922?
I did.
And did you see anything on the pastor's desk when you went in on that Friday morning?
I did. I saw a newspaper clipping from the New York World Paper from September 14, 1922. It spoke about divorce and the Reverend Stickney Grant in New York.
Did you see your wife on Thursday, September 14?
In the evening, we had supper, and after supper, I started to work on some window boxes.
And what time did your wife leave?
She left at 7:30.
And after your wife went out, then what happened?
I stayed home and worked there until about 9:45. Then I went in the house and started to work in there a little bit inside under the gas lights on the table on the back porch. While I was working there, my daughter and son came in.
And where did your daughter and son go?
They stayed in the house. My daughter was upstairs and my son was in the kitchen when I left.
Did you go on the front stoop?
I did. I waited for Eleanor to come back. Around 11 o'clock, I went from there and got a glass of soda water at the store on Commercial Avenue. Then I went to the church. I closed the windows, put out the lights, locked the door, and came home. Went to bed around 11:20.
And what happened next?
I woke up around 3 o'clock and I saw the light burning in the kitchen. So I went upstairs to my daughter's room to see if her mother was there. For the past 2 years or so, Eleanor has slept in Charlotte's room instead of with me.
And then what did you do?
I went right to the church to see if she may have perhaps fainted and be somewhere in there. She wasn't.
Then what did you do after that?
I came home and went to bed.
And what time did you get up?
Got up at 5:45, but my wife still was not home. So I went down to the store and bought buns and had coffee and had everything ready on the stove for the children's breakfast.
And then what did you do?
Then I went over to the Lord Sterling School across the street where I work.
Did you see Mrs. Hall at any time that day?
Yes, I did. I saw her between 8:30 and 9 o'clock that Friday morning.
And what did she
Well, I'd gone to the church and was in Mr. Hall's study when she came in.
And what did she say, if anything, to you?
She says to me, "Good morning, Mr. Mills." I said, "Good morning, Mrs. Hall." She said, "Did you have any sickness in your home last night?" I said, "No." She said, "Mr. Hall had not come home all night." And I said, "My wife had not come home all night." And as something cropped up, I said, "Do you think that they have eloped?" And she said, "God knows. I think that they are dead and ain't coming home."
Didn't you testify before the first grand jury when you saw Mrs. Hall, or when she saw you, you said, "Can they have eloped?" And she said, "No, they are both dead. They had been together and they met the same fate." Didn't you so testify?
I cannot recall that.
Didn't you testify before the first grand jury that Mrs. Hall said there must be foul play or that they would be home? Didn't you so testify that way?
Now, if the court please,
Now, if you're going to make another oration,
is counsel to be constantly spoke to that way? Now you can make your oration? Aren't the decencies to be observed? I hate very much to be spoken to in the way that this Assistant Attorney General is doing.
Court is doing what it can to see that this case is conducted in an orderly way. And if counsel will keep his objection until the question is finished, perhaps there will be less difficulty.
Well, I respectfully hope that when I make an objection, it will not be called an oration.
If you make your objection at an improper time, you're likely to have some difficulty over it.
And are we to call it an oration?
I didn't call it an oration.
May I ask the court to instruct counsel not to constantly criticize my objections in that manner?
No, sir. The court will not do this at this time.
thank you, Your Honor. Now, Mr. Mills, after that, when was the next time that you saw Mrs. Hall?
I saw her at my home at noontime.
And will you state whether or not she at that time referred in any way to the fact that she had that morning early telephoned to the police headquarters without giving her name and asked if there were any casualties?
Yes. Then she asked me if I'd heard anything. I said, no, Mrs. Hall, I haven't heard anything.
And when was the last time you saw her that day?
No. She came to my house at 5 o'clock in the evening. Again, she asked me if I heard anything. I said, no, if I hear anything, I will let you know.
Did she say anything about your wife coming home or being away from home? What exactly did she say?
She wanted to know if I heard anything about it.
Of your wife?
Yes.
Whether the...
I object.
I withdraw the unfinished question, strangled in its birth by the objection. Now, when was the last time you saw her on Friday?
No, I saw her after 8 in her own home.
Was there anything else said?
I said, I don't know what to make of it, Mrs. Hall. And she said to me, they must be dead or they would come home.
I have no further questions.
Your wife used to take automobile drives with Mr. Hall,
Yes, sir.
and the day before her murder, you knew that she went to Lake Apacon
Yes, sir.
in the company with Mr. and Mrs. Hall, Mrs.
Yes.
Hall Sr. and Mrs. Mina Clark as well.
Yes.
Now, you were by trade, I think, a shoemaker,
Yes, for some 20 years.
and did you have a kit of tools?
No, just carried a knife, that is all. Knives and stones like that for cutting purposes.
Mr. Mills, isn't it a fact that on the Wednesday evening immediately preceding the Thursday upon which your wife was killed, either just before or just after returning from Lake Apacon, you in the hall found either a scarf or a coat of Mrs. Mills, tucked into which were some letters, 8 or 9 in numbers, which you pulled out of the pocket or receptacle in the coat? Isn't that a fact?
No, sir.
And I would ask you, Mr. Mills, if at the interview with Ellis Parker, to whom I've alluded to twice before, were you not asked and didn't you answer as follows? Question. Mr. Mills, did you ever see any letters your wife wrote Mr. Hall or Mr. Hall wrote your wife? Answer. Absolutely no. Question. Did you see any letters at all? Answer. Yes, all the letters they found on the body, I saw them. Question. Before the murder. Answer. There were 2 letters in the scarf, 3 letters. They were sheets of tagnals, never been in the mail, never in the mail, were not dated or signed. Question. Who were they addressed to? Answer. One was dear and one was honey.
I do not recall.
Did you find any letters in the handwriting of your wife or writings in the handwriting of your wife in a scarf or a coat in the hall or room of your house on the Wednesday evening preceding your wife's murder?
I cannot recall it.
When your wife went out Thursday evening, the last time that you saw her, and you asked her where she was going, she said, "Follow me and find out." You had no curiosity?
No, sir, I did not leave the stoop.
Now, when she went out and you asked her, "Where are you going?" and she said, "Follow me to find out." You knew, didn't you, that there were in existence, or had been the night before, unsigned letters by her, which you knew contained the word honey and dear?
I could not recall that at that time.
Well, next morning came, your wife had not come home, had she?
Yes.
And you went to work as usual after gotten breakfast?
Yes.
You did not make any inquiry at the police station or at the hospital?
No, sir, I did not.
Now, you received sometime within a few months after your wife's death, $500
I did.
in the form of a check to your order for some letters that you were said to have been written by Mr. Hall and some diaries, did you not?
Yes, sir.
And those documents were found in your house after your wife's death.
Yes, sir.
Now, whose check was that?
The New York American newspaper.
That's one of the Hearst papers?
I think it is.
No further questions.
I call Mary Demarest to the witness stand.
On Friday morning, September 15th, 1922, the day after the murders, I was on a trolley in downtown New Brunswick. As I got off the trolley, I saw Henry Stevens sitting in his car. It was just a quarter before 10 when I saw him.
I object to this, Your Honor. If the prosecutor thinks that it's important that he should make his connection before he introduces his evidence, I object to reversing the order of proof. It's harmful.
I think the senator is in reverse himself, because a minute ago, he said if it was to be connected up, he would have no objection, provided...
You're talking about something else. You're not talking about this.
Oh, well, yes, I am. You're not following this case closely.
Thank you. I'm doing the best that I can. Of course, I have not your brains, so I cannot follow this carefully as you.
If I had yours, I would not be trying this case.
1 minute, gentlemen.
I envy you the possession of your brain.
I also remember seeing Reverend Hall and Mrs. Mills sitting on the bench in Bucolic Park twice in May 1922. Both times I also saw Ralph Gorsline and Minnie Clark close by, and they were standing with Mr. Gorsline's car, appearing to be looking in the direction of Reverend Hall and Mrs. Mills. They may have been spying on them. I don't know.
I call Adam Schultz to the witness stand.
I'm the medical assistant to the district attorney in New York County. In the past 30 years, I've done autopsies in hundreds of homicide cases. I performed an autopsy on the body of Eleanor Mills. She had 3 bullet wounds to her head, any one of which would have been fatal. Each of the wounds were caused by .32 caliber bullets. She also had a severe wound made from left to right on her neck. It appeared her neck was practically severed with one forceful cut from ear to ear. Additionally, her windpipe, larynx, and tongue were all cut out and removed. As the prosecutor pointed out, they are all organs used in singing. I also did an autopsy of the body of Edward Hall. The cause of his death was a .32 caliber bullet through his head.
I call Barbara 2 to the witness stand.
I was a maid in the Hall residence for about 5.5 years before the murders. I once saw Eleanor Mills sitting on Reverend Hall's knee while they were in the guild room in the church. When they saw me, Eleanor jumped off his knee. Then she started laughing hysterically and saying, "Oh, it's only Barbara." Dr. Hall did not speak, but he looked very angry at me. That was back in 1918. By 1922, the gossip was pretty prevalent about their relationship. On the night of the murders, I came home at 10 p.m. sharp. I didn't see anybody at the time. Around 2 a.m., I heard Mrs. Hall get up, go to the bathroom, and come back to her room. I did not hear her pounding on Willie's door at all that night. By the way, Willie had a revolver in his desk. He showed it to me sometimes.
I call Louise Geist to the witness stand.
I was the other maid in the Hall household in 1922. Along toward evening that day, the phone rang. It was Eleanor Mills calling for Reverend Hall. I told her I would get him. I walked from the telephone over to the top of the stairway and looked over the banister. That's when I saw Mrs. Hall lifting the receiver off the hook. I told her it was for Mr. Hall. When he came to the phone, I heard him tell Mrs. Mills, "Yes, yes, yes, that is too bad. I was going down to the church a little later. Can we make arrangements for later, say about 8:15? A little later he left, telling Mrs. Hall he was going out to see about the Mills bill. The next morning, I got up early and went down to the dining room. Mr. William Stevens was there, and I asked him what he was doing up so early. He said, "I would rather not tell you. I would rather have Mrs. Hall tell you. There was something terrible happened last night, and Mrs. Hall and I have been up most of the night."
In a way, Louise Geist was partly responsible for this whole trial. After the murder, she had married a gentleman by the name of Arthur Reel. On July 3rd, 1926, he filed a petition for annulment for Louise. In the petition, he asserted that Louise told him that she, Mrs. Hall, Willie Stevens, and another man had driven to the Phillips farm on the night of the murder. Reel also claimed that his wife had been paid off to keep silence about that. Philip Payne, the managing editor of the New York Daily Mirror, a newspaper owned by William Randolph Hearst, broke the story to help boost the paper's circulation. It worked. The unsolved mystery roared back into the national psyche. And soon after, Governor A. Harry Moore of New Jersey appointed State Senator Alexander Simpson as special prosecutor, and we news reporters were off to the races.
I call Jane Gibson to the witness stand.
Liar! She's a liar! Don't believe
Folks, you have to excuse that woman. That's Mrs. Salome Serenner. She's the mother of this witness, and as you can probably tell, they don't get along too well. Due to the pig woman's medical condition, she came straight from the hospital and testified in court from a hospital gurney.
Now, Ms. Gibson, on the night of the 14th of September, 1922, what was your occupation?
Farming.
And where was your farm?
Hamilton Road, New Brunswick.
On the night, where were you between the hours of 8 and 9?
Between 8 and 9, I was sitting at my home listening. I had been robbed on Sunday, or I discovered it on Monday, and I tied the dog out to a tree and between the road and the house, and I listened there. I listened every night.
On Thursday night, were you listening?
Yes, sir, I was listening then.
And what did you do then, when you heard the wagon stop in the middle of the cornfield that they had stolen from the Sunday night before?
I went to the barn and I put the saddle on my mule Jenny and I started out on the road.
And which way did you go?
Toward New Brunswick.
Did you or did you not hear the wagon ahead of you as you followed?
Yes, I did. It settled and went down DeRussie's Lane.
And did you keep following it?
I did. When I got down in the lane, the mule brayed, so I tied her to a tree.
Then after you tied your mule, where did you go?
I walked slowly to DeRussie's Lane. I was going to look for the wagon and follow him on foot.
And as you got closer to the cedar tree, what, if anything, did you hear or see?
I heard mumbling voices toward the left of me.
Men's voices?
Men's voices and women's voices.
And what did you do then? Still keep coming?
I stood still. They were coming closer all the time.
Were you able to make out any words when they got close to you?
Yes.
And what word?
Well, the men were talking, and a woman said very quick, "Explain these letters."
And what did you hear the men say, if anything?
They were saying GD it and everything else.
Did you hear more than one man say something?
Somebody was hitting. I could hear somebody's mind going out. And somebody said, ugh. Then somebody said, GD it, let go. A man hollered, God damn it, let go.
And immediately after that, what did you hear?
Then somebody threw a flash toward where they were hollering.
A flashlight?
Yes, and I see something glitter, and I see a man, and I see another man like they were wrestling together.
Did you see any faces there?
Yes, I see two faces.
Had you identified these two men's faces since?
Yes.
And who were they?
One was Henry Stevens.
And after you saw Henry Stevens' face, did you hear anything?
Yes, the light went out, and I heard a shot.
Then what did you hear?
Then I heard like something fall heavy. Then I ran for the mule.
Did you hear a woman say anything?
Yes, there were two women.
And did you hear a woman's voice after you heard the shot?
One said, "Oh, Henry, easy, very easy." And the other began to scream so loud, "Oh my, oh my, oh my!" So terribly loud.
And after you heard the shot and heard the woman say, "Oh, Henry," in a soft way, and the other woman screamed very loud, did you hear anything in the way of shots after the first shot?
I ran for the mule after the first shot. But that woman was screaming, trying to run away or something. Screaming. And I just about got my foot in the stirrup when bang, bang, bang. Three more shots.
There were more shots?
Yes, 3 more shots.
When you got home, what happened at that point?
Well, I got off the mule, and then I got the mule into the stable and put the mule in the barn, and I got my foot wet. That's when I first missed my moccasin.
And then where did you go?
Well, I went into the house and I sat around a while and I got to thinking over the corn and about other things and about my moccasin. And I was so nervous when I started back that I found that the moon was out.
When you got back there, what did you find?
I said, something is the matter out here. And then I listened and then I heard the voice of a man. It seemed kind of like a woman hollered along there or someone. And then I heard the voice of a man and the moon was shining down very bright. And so I heard it again and I looked right at the cedar. And I crossed over the lane right at the cedar and I seen a big white-haired woman doing something with her hand, crying, something.
Was she standing up?
No, kneeling down fixing something.
Did you see who it was?
Yes, the woman I seen in the lane earlier in the evening, Mrs. Hall.
Do you see the lady in this room?
That looks like the lady.
And you say William Stevens. Can you point him out?
Right there with the glasses.
And you see Henry Stevens.
Yeah, over there.
These are the men that you saw that night?
Yes, sir.
Have you any doubt whatsoever at all about the certainty?
No, no doubt. They are all the same men.
Your witness.
Mrs. Gibson, are you familiar with Mr. George Totten?
Yes,
And are you acquainted with Ferdinand David?
yes.
And do you remember that one evening while the investigation was being made, after you had told of your experience and also in the evening when Mr. David and Mr. Totten followed you in an automobile and they asked you the route from your house down to the scene of the murder?
Yes,
And you were requested by them to do precisely what you had done on the night of the tragedy, were you not?
yes.
Now, on that evening, did you not tell Mr. Totten and Mr. David that while you were riding your mule along to Rusey's Lane, you saw the flash and heard the shot?
No, I did not.
You know Mr. James Mason, a detective connected with the prosecutor's department of Essex County?
I've heard of him.
Do you remember while this investigation was on in 1922, whether or not you said to him that you heard the shots while you were still on your mule going up to Rusey's Lane?
No, sir.
You remember that in about the month of July 1923, Sheriff Conklin had a conversation with you on Main Street here in Somerville, in which he said to you, Jane, do you think the Stevens family had anything to do with the murders?
No.
And you replied, I don't.
No, he never asked me that.
Now, on or about the 17th of October, 1922, at the prosecutor's office in New Brunswick, were you able to identify either Mrs. Hall or William Stevens or Henry Stevens?
I went in there. I wasn't supposed to identify anybody.
You know Mr. John Fitzgerald, then a reporter for the Camden Daily Courier?
Yes.
And did you not on that occasion say to Mr. John Fitzgerald that you could not identify anybody?
Reporters were asking a lot of questions. What would you do? Stand there and tell them all you know?
The question is, did you say that?
I said I had nothing to say.
On or about 17th of October, 1922, did you not say to Mr. Ferd David of the prosecutor's office in New Brunswick that you could not identify Mrs. Hall?
No.
And did you not at the same time tell him that you could not identify Henry Stevens?
No.
And did you not at the same time tell him you could not identify William Stevens?
No.
Now, how near the crabapple tree were you?
About 15 feet.
And how did you get to that location?
Well, I heard a mumbling and talking and swearing and quarreling and the fighting and the hammering and the swearing of the cursing and everything else.
And did you want to find out what it was all about?
Well, I stopped to listen.
You did not approach any nearer to them than when you were before you tied your mule, right?
Oh, yes.
How much nearer?
I was about 10 feet from the big cedar.
But you were farther away than the lane was that you speak of, weren't you?
The lane?
Yes,
No.
the lane between you and the crabapple tree, wasn't it?
Sure. And there was lots of brush between the lane and the crabapple tree.
And you at no time got nearer to the crabapple tree on this particular occasion than you've just mentioned, didn't you?
I was near enough to it, about 10 feet from the cedar tree, when the squabbling started way off over there, and then began to go over that way then, and it seemed like it came around again, and then the blows started.
How long was it going on?
Oh, I guess about 10 or 15 minutes, maybe a little longer. I don't know.
Now, the people as they quarreled were walking apparently, were they not?
Yes, they were fighting back and forth.
What do you mean fighting back and forth?
They were talking, and swearing and mumbling, and mumbling, and mumbling.
And they kept getting nearer?
They kept coming nearer, and finally they went to the right, and then to the left, and finally came to the blows.
Now, up to that time, there had been no blows, had there?
No, I don't think there were.
The blows came right at the crabapple tree?
Right there, somewhere, near that cedar tree.
Between the cedar tree and the crabapple tree?
Somewhere near it.
And you had stood still all the time?
I stood still.
How many people were there that you saw?
There were 3 or 4 people.
Now, you've given, have you not, Mrs. Gibson, a number of official interviews to newspapers?
No.
Did you not give an interview authorized to be used with your name to the New York American and published by them on first day of August, 1926?
No, I do not remember.
And did you not say at that authorized interview, I saw 3 figures in the moonlight?
No.
When you got back the second time, you said you had started from home about what time?
The second time?
Yes.
I guess I left about quarter or 20 minutes to 12. I'm not sure which.
And did you have any trouble in coming to the exact spot where you had been?
No.
Why not?
Because the moon was shining bright and I could go right just where I was.
Now, you saw a woman there who was apparently in deep distress, didn't you?
She was in deep distress. She let out a screech.
She was crying?
Seemed like she was doing something.
She was clearly in trouble then.
Might have been. I could not say that. I figured if she went there.
But when you found out that she was in trouble, why didn't you go and give her a woman's consolation and help?
When I see a white woman with a colored man, it serves them right.
But you did not see a colored man there.
Yes, I had earlier in the evening.
That was several hours earlier in the evening, was it?
Yes.
That you saw Mrs. Hall
Yes.
into Rusey's Lane with the colored man?
Yes.
But you had heard shots there.
Yes, I had.
And you had heard a fight there.
Yes.
And it was at that spot that you saw this woman that you observed crying in the moonlight.
Yes.
Now, Mrs. Gibson, you've made quite some money, have you not, from your connection with this affair?
Money?
Didn't you get paid a large sum of money by the newspapers?
No, nobody paid me large sums of money. I didn't get large sums of money from any newspapers. These snappers come along. Zippo, do they pay you out here when they take you?
Didn't you get paid sums of money by the newspapers?
No.
In January or February of 1923, did you not tell Mr. Ellis Parker that you had received $700 from the newspapers?
No.
Did you not, in the month of March 1923, exhibit yourself and your mule Jenny at the Marine $1 Million Circus at the Armory, Broadway and 66th Street in New York City?
That was a charity affair.
Didn't you?
To help the Marines. I did not get a penny out of it. All they paid was the transportation, and I paid my own ticket.
Did you not tell Mr. Mason of the prosecutor's office of Essex County that the 2 men you had seen at the prosecutor's office in New Brunswick were not the men that you had seen at the Rusey's Lane on the farm?
No, 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 no.
In October of 1922, didn't you tell them that?
No.
Or the month of November either?
No, I didn't talk to anybody about it. Every Tom, Dick, and Harry was asking me questions. And should I answer everybody? I didn't say anything.
I have no further questions for this witness.
Your Honor, no redirect.
Once the state had finished the testimony of its 87 witnesses, the defense team went into action. Robert McCarter started by giving his opening statement to the jury.
Gentlemen of the jury, I'm going to forecast a little of the evidence with regard to Mrs. Gibson's testimony, because it is she chiefly who relates anything with respect to the actual commission of the tragedy at this point. I'm calling it to your attention now as something that we expect to prove, because it goes directly to the veracity of her testimony, and it goes to the probability of what she could see taking place at the crabapple tree when her observation was made from the Rusey's Lane, as she then told it. Gentlemen of the jury, none of the defendants were there. None of the defendants had anything to do with it. None of the defendants knew anything about it either before or after the sad, sad tragedy. They knew nothing about it and had nothing to do with it. Now, there had been talk of gossip, talk of rumor, talk of whispering. Whatever there may have been, none of it came to Mrs. Hall's ears. To the day of his death, and for the years after, he was to be the perfect husband, the man whom she was true and who she believed that was true to her. Mrs. Mills was one of the active women in this little church. She was in all the church activities, and necessarily she was in contact with Mr. Hall and with Mrs. Hall. And there was the utmost feelings of friendliness on Mrs. Hall's part for Mr. Mills. Mrs. Hall will tell you all that she knows. Now, the evening passed, and Mr. Hall had not returned. Mrs. Hall worried and worried, wondering where her husband was, thinking something must have happened to him. And finally, having stood it as long as her wifely heart could endure the strain, she goes to her brother's room and rouses him, and together they start down to the church, thinking that perhaps Mr. Hall had been in the church and had fallen asleep there. They got to the church and find that the church is dark, and the door apparently was locked. Then Mrs. Hall, remembering that he was going to see something about the Mills bill, and thinking that perhaps there might have been some sickness there at that house, and it was holding him there, she goes down to the Mills house and finds that house locked. Then they go home, but not to sleep. And the next morning, after a sleepless night, she got up and she phoned the police to ask if there had been any accidents. Nothing had come in. At no time has there been any effort on the part of the defense to withhold full information from the state. At all times, these defendants have given everything that they have to give in the way of information, and they've offered to help as best they can. And with regard to this card, this calling card, but it states saying it had the fingerprints of William Stevens on it, State's Exhibit S-17. We'll show to you that this is not fingerprint at all. Then I think that we can convince you that the whole card business is a hocus pocus. A hocus pocus. Now, just in closing this opening, telling you what we are going to do, let me say that each of these defendants will be placed on the stand to tell her story, to tell his story as the case may be, and we believe when that has been done, these things have been placed before you, your conscience and your minds will be free to acquit them. The defense calls Henry Stevens to the stand. Mr. Stevens, how old are you?
I'm 57 years of age. In fact, today is my birthday.
Happy birthday, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Where do you live?
I live in Lavallette, New Jersey.
And what relationship are you to Mrs. Hall?
I am her brother.
And to William Stevens?
He is my brother.
Now, what has been your business?
Well, I've been retired since 1920. Previous to that, I managed the DuPont trap shooting school in Atlantic City. I taught people the use of trap shooting with shotguns. Previous to that, I was on the road as a demonstrator, an advertising man, if you will, for the Remington Arms Union Metallic Cartridge Company.
Did you have any knowledge of pistols or revolvers?
Yes, I did.
So you were familiar with pistol cartridges?
Yes, I was.
Did you ever own any pistol?
Oh, many years ago.
Have you had any experience in the use of firing of revolvers?
Very, very little. I have not fired one in over 15 years.
You know what the distance is by road from Lavallette to New Brunswick?
Oh, approximately 50 miles.
And you said that on the evening of September 14th, you had supper at your house. Can you give us about the hour of supper?
Yes, it was in the evening, about 6 o'clock.
Go ahead.
Well, shortly after supper, I went out on the beach fishing.
Go ahead.
I fished there on and off until about 9 o'clock in the evening. I remember returning to the house. And I also remember early in the evening, just before I started fishing, going over to a neighbor's house and leaving word there that the fish were biting.
Whose neighbor's house was this?
That was Mr. Eggers.
Very well. You said that after supper you were fishing. Proceed.
Well, after supper, I went a little to the north of the house. I fished there for a while. Along about dusk, a man came along with a good-sized bluefish.
And who was it?
That was Arthur Applegate. I walked up to him to look at the fish, and I said, I'll weigh it for you.
How much did it weigh?
Oh, it weighed 6 pounds.
Go ahead.
Well, after that, I went back fishing on the beach, and I was joined shortly after that by Mr. Egger.
You say you were going by him?
I came back to the house in order to clean and put away 3 fish that I had caught. Doing that, I went back onto the beach again. I went down, picked up my rod and my tackle box, and I came back to the house. Mr. Egger accompanied me, or followed me, I'm not sure which, and then we went into the house.
Your house?
Yes, sir, our house. We had a drink of ginger ale or root beer or some sort of soft drink that I had in the icebox, and we talked for 2 or 3 minutes, and then Mr. Egger went home. After that, I busied myself around the house.
Now, Mr. Stevens, what arrangements had you made with the Wilsons with respect to the next day?
Well, I was to drive them to Point Pleasant after lunch on Friday so that they could go from there to Jersey City.
And what time did you get up on Friday?
Oh, about a half an hour before sunrise, I wanted to catch some bait.
Where did you have your lunch?
At my home. After lunch, I drove my friends, the Wilsons, to Point Pleasant to catch the train, and that left around 1:30.
Proceed.
Well, I saw them on the train, and I went up into town.
On Saturday, you received a telegram marked D18. New Brunswick, New Jersey, 1:16 p.m. Henry E. Stevens, Lavalette, New Jersey. Edward Hall has been killed. Come at once. My house. E.R. Carpenter. Who is E.R. Carpenter?
Mr. Carpenter is my cousin.
Well, then what did you do?
Well, I packed a bag or a suitcase, and I got ready to leave on the train and left Lavalette. I think it was about 4:25, 4:30, daylight savings time.
Go ahead.
Well, I took the train to Lavalette at Monmouth Junction. Well, I should say I took the train from Lavalette. We went through Monmouth Junction, and I saw a copy of the New Brunswick Home News of that date, and I bought a copy, and for the first time, I saw what had occurred.
Go ahead.
I then went out to New Brunswick and arrived there around 6:30. I was met at the station by my cousin, Edwin Carpenter, and I went to his house.
Were you in New Brunswick at any time on Friday, the 15th of September, 1922?
No, sir, I was not.
Your witness.
Mr. Stevens, were you ever known as the Remington small arms expert, or were you ever a small arms expert for the Remington people?
No, I was only a shotgun expert.
But your business was dealing with revolver ammunition, wasn't it?
It was.
And you gave a statement on September 26, 2022.
I did.
And you told Captain Walsh that you stopped fishing around 9 o'clock at night on September 14, didn't you?
That is true.
And you didn't say anything in the statement to Mr. Walsh, but having seen Edgar and how Edgar walked home with you?
No, sir, I did not.
You knew it was important, though, didn't you? If you were suspected of this crime, to get all the reasonable evidence that you could to show that you could not have possibly been at the scene of the crime, didn't you?
Well, naturally.
And you cannot tell them why it was less than 2 weeks after the murder, which nobody knowing at the time the shots were fired, you put yourself at Lavalette on the beach up to 10:30 at night, except as you have answered about, is that right?
That is correct.
Oh, did you attend your sister's wedding?
No, I did not.
Now, your absence from her wedding, it doesn't indicate that you hated Mr. Hall and didn't want her to marry him?
No, there's no relationship.
In June, your sister did not tell you that she had learned her husband was having an affair with a woman in the parish? You didn't know anything about that?
I did not. She never told me that.
And you are the only relative you know that was addressed by your sister as Henry?
The only one, I believe.
Your witness.
No further questions. Thank you. The defense calls William Egger to the stand.
On the evening of September 14th, 1922, I was fishing with Henry Stevens on the beach in Lavalette, New Jersey. We fished from around 7:30 to 9:30 when we went to his house. I went to his home about a half hour later. We drank a glass of ginger ale, smoked a cigar, and I went home, arriving there around 10:30.
Defense calls William Stevens to the stand. Mr. Stevens, how old are you?
44, sir.
Willie, isn't it 54?
Yeah, I guess so.
Now, Mr. Stevens, have you ever suffered from, or do you now suffer from, epilepsy?
No, sir.
How long have you worn glasses?
Ever since I was a very young child, a very young boy.
Can you see to get along without them?
Very, very poorly.
Mr. Stevens, are you the brother of Mrs. Frances Hall and Mr. Henry Stevens?
Yes, I am.
Do you know Mr. James Mills?
Only by sight, sir.
What were your relations with your brother-in-law, Mr. Edward Hall?
We were always very cordial.
Had you at any time prior to the month of September 1922 had a revolver?
Yes, I had.
And do you know when last before, let's say the month of September 1922, had you used that revolver?
I cannot tell you.
Was it a matter of days, weeks, months, years?
Years, sir.
Now, I'm going to ask you, Mr. Stevens, if you will tell us what you remember of your movements on Thursday, the 14th of September, 1922.
As far as I know, I was only simply in New Brunswick. I came home, I believe, to my home for dinner, and I also for some supper. I remained in the house, and I left at 2:30 in the morning with my sister.
Mr. Stevens, I want to ask you whether you were present at or had anything to do with the murder of either Mr. Hall or Mrs. Mills.
Absolutely nothing at all, sir.
Do you know anything about it?
No, sir, I do not.
Your witness.
Mr. Stevens, where were you born?
I was born in Aiken, South Carolina.
Have you ever earned a livelihood?
Yes, for about 4 or 5 years, I was employed by Mr. Seasbold. He was a contractor. And do you want to know his address, sir?
No. When was that?
That was, I believe, before the murder.
And how long before the murder?
Maybe a year or so, sir.
And when your sister woke you up, how did she wake you up?
She woke me up by knocking at my door.
Did she tell you that her husband had not been home all night, that she didn't know what happened to him, and she was in a great state of mind?
I could not say. I was only just awake, sir.
When you went out and went down to the church, didn't she seem agitated?
Not necessarily.
Well, what was going on? What was she going for, according to you?
To see whether I was at the church.
And she was alarmed, wasn't she, about her husband's disappearance?
She did not seem to be raving or agitated.
Was she alarmed at his disappearance?
She was worried a little bit.
You didn't find him there, and she said, let us go down to the Mills house?
Yes.
And when you got to the Mills house, you and she went in search of Mr. Hall, didn't you?
Yes.
And did you knock on the door and get any reply to see if Mr. Hall was there?
No, sir, the lights were not burning in the house.
Did you make any effort to find out whether the Reverend Hall had fallen ill and was the Mills home to which you had gone to find him?
No, I didn't.
You simply went, looked at the house, and turned and came back.
Yes, sir.
When you came down in the morning, did you tell Louise Geist something terrible has happened last night and don't tell her I told you?
I have no recollection of that, sir.
You don't remember whether you said that or not?
No, sir.
When was the last time that you saw Henry Stevens before that night?
Maybe for over a year. Maybe for over a year.
Do you remember being at the firehouse on the Friday before the bodies were found in New Brunswick and talking to some firemen?
Before the murder? I haven't any recollection of that instance. I might have possibly have been.
Now, on the Saturday, the 16th of September, at a time before the bodies were found, did you have a talk with Captain Regan of the fire department?
I have no recollection of that, sir.
And did you tell him that something was going to happen?
I have no recollection of that either.
Did you state in an examination at the Middlesex County Prosecutor's Office that as far as you can remember, you felt that something was wrong in the house, in the family?
I don't have any recollection of that.
And on the Saturday before the bodies were found, and the Saturday after the murder, you don't remember that?
That is my answer, sir.
By the way, how long had you kept a loaded revolver in your room at the time of the murder, loaded with bullet cartridges?
For about 30 years.
And your relations with your sister were very close, weren't they? Very affectionate.
Yes, sir.
And you tried to do everything that she wished you to do.
I did.
And you were concerned about her happiness, weren't you?
I was.
And if you had known that Dr. Hall and Mrs. Mills had an affair, and that Mrs. Hall was losing her husband, would not that have caused you a great deal of concern?
Probably would have.
And you would have wanted to help your sister in any way you could?
I would.
And Dr. Hall's church was not your church.
Oh, he was not a doctor, sir. He was a reverend, Mr. Hall.
He was not Dr. Hall?
No, he was not.
And he was not a doctor of any kind?
No, sir.
Well, I'm glad you corrected me on that. You did not go to his church?
No, I didn't.
So you were not aware if anything was going on between Dr. Hall and Mrs. Mills. It was not under your eye, and you did not see it?
No, sir, absolutely not.
Well, after 9:30 on September 14, nobody saw you, did they?
No, they didn't.
Did you go out with your sister on Friday morning when she telephoned outside of the house?
No, sir, I did not.
You don't remember what your movements were on Friday then?
No, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Stevens.
You stand down.
Defense calls Ferd David to the stand.
I worked for the Middlesex County Prosecutor's Office at the time of the murder. During the investigation in 1922, I was present in a conference with Mrs. Gibson in company with Detective Totten from Somerset County. Mrs. Hall was in one room and Henry and William Stevens were in another room. That time, Mrs. Gibson said she could not identify any of those defendants. When I testified before the first Somerset County grand jury on November 28, 1922, the one that did not return any indictments, I testified under oath that I was present when Mrs. Gibson first identified Henry Stevens.
The defense calls Russell Reed to the stand.
I live in Franklin Township, the same town where Mrs. Gibson lives. I am a township committeeman. I've known her for about 15 years. Her reputation for truth and veracity in the community is bad.
The defense calls Francis Noel Hall to the stand. Mrs. Hall, where were you born?
I was born in Aiken, South Carolina,
In what year?
1874.
And when were you married to Mr. Hall?
We were married on the 20th day of July, 1911, at Christ Church.
Was your husband older or younger than you?
Well, Edward, he was 7 years younger, sir.
At the time of your marriage, where were you living? What house?
Well, in the house where I live now. That's at 23 Nickel Ave in New Brunswick.
I want to ask you this question, Mrs. Hall. Whether during your husband's life, so far as you know or observed, your husband was a devoted husband?
Absolutely.
Did you, at the time you learned of his death, notice the slightest change or alteration in his demeanor or conduct to you?
Nothing whatsoever in any possible way.
Do you remember whether William had a pistol?
Yes,
Do you remember your husband, at your suggestion or otherwise, doing anything to that pistol?
I do.
And about when was that, Mrs. Hall?
Well, that must have been about 2 years or maybe 3 years before the tragedy.
And what was done?
The firing pins, I think it was filed down that was cut by my husband.
Where did Willie keep that pistol?
But I don't remember, either in his bureau or his closet.
Did you ever see your brother William fire that pistol?
No, never, sir.
Did you endeavor to assist your husband in parish work?
Oh, in every way that I could, including I used to teach the Sunday school.
Now, did you know Eleanor Mills?
Oh, I did. I saw her frequently at the church in connection with the work done in the church. And, you know, for a short time, she was in my Sunday school class.
And she was an active worker in the church, wasn't she?
Oh, yes, she was.
You know of anyone among the congregation that you can recall now who manifested a greater zeal and activity in the church work than she?
I think Mrs. Minna Clark did as much.
And you had the same kind of acquaintance with her?
Yes. Your Honor, there's a camera in the third row there snapping, Your Honor.
Your officer will take that man up the third row with the camera. Take his camera away from him.
Mrs. Hall, you recall the fact that early in the year 1922, Eleanor Mills was ill?
Yes.
And was that illness of sufficient seriousness to require her to go to the hospital?
Yes, it was.
Who took her to the hospital?
Well, I did. I took her by myself in my car.
While she was there, did you visit her?
I did.
And how often?
Well, it was a good many times I saw her.
Now, she underwent some serious operation while she was there.
Yes, sir.
Do you remember how she got home after she was convalescent?
I took her home in my car.
Now, did you take any part toward contributing to the expenses that she was subjected to by that illness in the hospital?
I did.
Now, you were accustomed to take a vacation in summer, were you not, you and your husband?
Yes, sir.
Referring now to the last summer, the summer of 1922, where did you go for your holiday that year?
We went to Islesford, Maine, at the end of July.
And at that time, had you noticed any change whatever in his demeanor or conduct toward you?
No, none whatever.
Just apparently as devoted as ever?
Oh, yes, sir.
Had he been a devoted husband up to that time?
Absolutely.
Did you, while at Islesford, know of your husband receiving any letters directed to Islesford from Mrs. Mills?
Yes.
And what did these letters, so far as you can recall, that were written directly to Islesford by Mrs. Mills to your husband, shown by your husband to you, what did they say?
Well, they were, as near as I remember, a description of the evening services at the church. And yeah, Mrs. Mills, she was referring to the arranging of the flowers in the church.
Did you yourself, while at Alsford, receive any communication from Mrs. Mills?
Yes, sir, I did.
And did you show those letters that you received from her to Mr. Hall?
I did.
Did you know the letters that have been offered in evidence in this case, either those found at the body of your husband or those found in the house of Mrs. Mills after your husband's death?
I never heard of them.
Have you ever heard of the diary that's been produced until after your husband's death?
No,
Did you know that he was keeping such a diary?
no.
Now, down to the time that your husband and you returned from Alsford, to the latter part of August of 1922, had anything occurred between your husband and you that showed the slightest change in his attitude toward you?
Absolutely nothing.
Was there any diminution in his affections?
I saw nothing whatever.
Had anything occurred at Alsford to indicate any change in his attitude toward you?
Nothing.
Had you any idea whatever that a clandestine correspondence was being carried on between your husband and Mrs. Mills?
No idea whatever.
Had you any idea that, as now appears in the evidence in this case, the apparent place of the exchange of those letters was in the church?
I never heard of it in any way.
So far as you know or observed, what were the relations between Mr. Hall and Mrs. Mills?
Well, she was simply one of the parishioners who was very active in the church work.
What were the relations, so far as you know or observed, between your husband and William?
Well, they were very friendly indeed.
Now, let's go back to the 13th. That's the day upon which the Hepatcon incident occurred. Had it been customary for you and Mr. Hall to have an annual outing with some members of your congregation?
That was the third year that we had, yes.
Well, on Wednesday, the 13th of September, the day before the tragedy, what occurred?
Well, we made that trip up to Lake Opatcon in our car, and we spent the day.
Who went?
Mr. Hall drove the car, and he took his mother. She sat in the front seat with him, and Mrs. Clark and Mrs. Hill and I, we were on the rear seat.
And you had an outing for the day?
Yes, sir.
Did anything unusual occur that day, different from any other day that you remember?
No, it was just a picnic.
And you went back to New Brunswick about what time?
Oh, I think it must have been nearly 9 o'clock in the evening.
Where did you leave Mrs. Mills and Mrs. Clark?
I don't remember whether we took them actually to their doors or let them at the corners nearest their house. I can't remember.
Upon your return that night, what did you do? Did you retire?
Yes, sir.
And you occupied, as usual, your room that night with your husband?
Yes, sir.
What kind of watch did your husband have?
He had an old-fashioned gold hunting case.
And what was attached to it by way of protection?
It was a fob, a ribbon fob.
Have you ever seen that since his death?
No, I have not.
You know whether your husband was accustomed to carrying, either in large or small amounts, money other than coin?
Well, he always had some money.
Some bills?
Yes, always had money with him.
Now, on the September 15th, you and Willie went out early that morning.
Yes, sir.
And you went where?
We walked down to the church on George Street, and there were no lights in the windows, and I think we went up to the front door, and we saw that it was locked.
Yes?
And I don't know that we tried it, and then I could not think of anything else to do, and Mr. Hall had spoke of going to the Millses, at least going to see about the bill, and I thought there was some possible chance that someone was ill there, and he might have gone there. So I walked down to Carmen Street, and I walked by the Millses' house. I looked up, I saw there was no light at all in the house, and then came back again.
You saw the whole apartment was dark, so you did not go up?
Yes, sir.
Now, how long were you, do you suppose, in your trip from the house down to the church and down to the mills and then back again to your house?
I guess less than half an hour.
And William was with you all the time?
The whole time.
Upon your return, what did you do?
I went to my room and again prepared for bed.
Did you sleep?
I did not sleep at all.
And Willie returned to his room?
Yes, sir.
What communication, if any, did you make with the police or anybody else the next morning?
About 7 o'clock, I called police headquarters and I asked if there'd been any accidents, and thinking, you know, the one thought in my mind was that there might have been an automobile accident, and maybe my husband might have been injured and, you know, maybe unable to communicate with me. And I asked that question, and they said that nothing had been reported.
Yes. Did you mention any names?
No, sir.
Why didn't you mention any names?
Well, I really didn't think it was necessary.
And then you had your breakfast?
I'm not sure whether I went out for breakfast or not.
At any rate, did you go out in the automobile?
Yes, I did. I went down past the church and I saw the door open.
Did you see Mr. Mills?
I did.
And did you have any conversation with him?
Yes, I asked him first if there had been anybody ill. I think I asked first at his house, and he said no. And I said, did Mr. Hall say where he was going when he went to your house last night? And he said that he did not know that Mr. Hall had been there. And I said, well, he's not been home all night. And Mr. Mills said, my wife has been away all night.
Do you remember anything further said either by Mr. Mills or yourself?
Then I do not remember the conversation very well, but he said, maybe they have gone to Coney Island, and that struck me as foolish.
Now, Mrs. Hall, when did you in fact learn of your husband's death?
About 1 o'clock on Saturday.
Did you request that the body be brought home?
No, I asked if it would be, and they said they thought it advisable not to. I think Mr. Hubbard told me this.
You were home on Saturday and Sunday, were you not, Mrs. Hall?
Yes, sir.
Did you kill your husband and Mrs. Mills?
I did not.
Did you play any part whatever in that dreadful tragedy?
I did not.
Did you participate in any way in it?
I did not.
Were you in or about DeRussi's Lane or Phillips Farm or in that neighborhood, or in the neighborhood of what is known as the Crabapple Tree on the evening of September 14, 1922?
I was not.
Have you given this jury your straightforward, accurate statement of your movements that night?
Absolutely.
What, so far as you're aware, were the relations between your husband and your brother Henry?
They were friendly.
Now, something was said earlier about Henry's not being at your wedding. Do you remember what the facts were about that?
He was away at the time.
Is your brother Willie, subject to epilepsy?
No, he's not.
How long has he worn glasses?
Well, since he was quite a child.
Is he left-handed?
No.
Your witness.
Mrs. Hall, the night of the murder, Chloe had you been married?
I was married in 1911.
And you say that there was no trouble whatsoever between your husband and you. You were not suspicious of him in any way and with any woman, and there's no sign on his part that his affection for you had diminished at all?
Absolutely not.
And he'd never been out all night before?
Never.
And you were frantic when you found out he was not home at 2 or 2:30 in the morning?
I was.
And you went right to the place where you thought he'd gone to, didn't you? At the Mills house.
That's where I thought he might be.
Where he told you he was going.
I thought I might hear of him.
And he had told you when he was going that he was going to the Mills house, didn't he?
Yes.
And the next morning, when you got up, you telephoned police headquarters.
I did.
And you were looking for information about your husband.
Yes, sir.
And you thought you would get it from the police.
Well, I thought I would hear of any accidents.
Accident was on your mind?
Yes, sir.
But you said to the police, have there been any casualties?
Doesn't that mean accidents?
Did you say, had there been any casualties?
I don't remember.
You so stated to Mr. Toolin.
I don't remember.
Weren't you looking to see if the dead bodies were found? Isn't that the reason you used the word casualties?
I don't know as I did use that word. I don't remember.
Well, didn't you hear Mr. Toolin read your statement here in which you told him, and the stenographer took it down, that, quote, early the next morning, I telephoned police headquarters and asked, had there been any casualties, unquote. What is your recollection about that?
I do not remember what word I used.
Well, casualties means death, doesn't it?
I don't know that it does.
Did you call a single hospital in New Brunswick all day on Friday?
No.
And you thought he'd been in an automobile accident. You went out in your car, and you never went near a hospital, though, did you?
I did not.
Now then, did he go out because of the telephone message?
I presume so, yes.
You did not hear it. Why do you presume so?
Because of what he said to me.
And what was it that he said to you that made you think he went out because of the telephone message?
He said to me, I'm going out to see about the bill.
Now, when this telephone call came at night, you took up the receiver off the hook, didn't you?
Yes, sir.
And you didn't hear anyone's voice?
I did not.
You didn't hear one word being said?
Not one word.
And Louise Geist was upstairs in the landing, wasn't she?
I believe so.
And you had been in the habit of being with people all your life?
I think so.
And yet this gentleman who had been married to you for 11 years, who poured out his heart to another woman in these love letters, in these diaries, never changed an iota in his demeanor to you?
He did not.
And he's always loving, always affectionate?
Always.
And your family has been notable, have they not? And I think the subject of remark among your friends, how close you and Mr. William and Mr. Henry have been in trouble.
Well, we've always been very close.
And you never communicated all day Friday with your brother Henry, but let the day drag along, and you went to bed yourself without indicating that Mr. Henry in any way that you were in trouble?
No.
You never offered a reward for the murders, did you?
I did not.
The newspapermen asked you about that in an interview, didn't they?
Yes, they did.
What reason did you give for not offering a reward for the discovery of the murder?
Well, I think it would almost be an indecent thing to do, sir.
Well, what was indecent about discovering those who had cut this woman's throat and had put 3 bullets in her head? Was there something indecent about trying to get that information, even if it was necessary to offer money?
That is not the point. This is a regular newspaper plan offering rewards.
And you did not suspect your husband with Mrs. Mills, did you?
No, sir.
You had no reason to suspect anything between her and your husband.
None whatever.
And yet, the morning after someone murdered your husband, you went to Jim Mills and said, they have met foul play, they are together, they are dead, didn't you?
I don't think so. I no.
The thought never occurred to you that your husband and Mrs. Mills might have been away together?
I did not know at all.
You knew they were absent, though, didn't you?
Well, yes, sir.
And didn't you fear that some harm had come to them?
I thought something. I did not know what.
Why do you think Mrs. Mills was with your husband?
Because when I saw James Mills in the morning, he told me his wife was away, and I knew that she was the last one Mr. Hall spoke to the evening before.
There's no suspicion in your mind with respect to Dr. Hall?
Certainly not.
You immediately put her with Dr. Hall when you found out she was away too, and you knew he was away all night. You put them both together, although you did not have any suspicion of them.
Well, I went there because he said he was going to speak to her that evening, and I thought that was the last place I knew he was going. He was going to speak to her, and that being that last place, I thought I could get some information from her family.
Tell us what you did all day after the disappearance to ascertain the whereabouts of your husband.
I told you. I telephoned the police in the morning to ask if there'd been any accidents. I telephoned a little later in the morning to my sister-in-law, and she and my other sister-in-law, they came in the middle of the day, and we discussed what could be done and what should be done. I sent for a lawyer and consulted with him for some little time in the afternoon and asked him if he would make any inquiries that were necessary, what considered the proper thing to do. I didn't know what to do.
So this man who was your life partner, whom you were devoted to, who up to that time of the murder and after, you believe was a spotless Christian gentleman, who was your husband and who loved you, you had somebody advise you and you never went out to be near. If you did not look at the remains, you never even went to be where he was.
No, I did not.
From the time that you knew he was murdered until he was put in Brooklyn without an autopsy, you never looked at his face.
I did not.
That is all.
The defense concluded its presentation of 70 witnesses. The prosecution made a motion for a mistrial, citing the misconduct of the jury for the same. He presented a series of affidavits to the court outlining 3 areas of misconduct. 1, at least 2 of the jurors had been sleeping during the testimony. 2, at least 2 of the jurors had spoken to the defense counsel without guards. And 3, manifest hostility of some of the jurors toward Mr. Simpson, who was described by one juror as a goddamn lying little son of a bitch. The judge denied the motion, and the case proceeded with closing arguments.
If your honors please, and gentlemen of the jury, just a month ago today, you gentlemen were summoned to perform a most important civil obligation, that of sitting at a trial and administering justice. You've been compelled to practically be in prison yourselves. You had to be separated from your families, from your business, and personally, I know of no discharge of a higher duty than what you have so patiently, and so far as I could tell, intelligently performing during the past month.
Mr. McCarter's closing argument took him 2 days to complete. He reminded the jurors of the promises Prosecutor Simpson made in his opening statement, and then proceeded to show how he failed to prove what he promised. The defense counsel carefully reviewed the testimony of the state's witnesses, poking holes in it as he went along. At one point, he took on the testimony about Willie's fingerprint on Reverend Hall's card.
In doing what I've just done and put my business card there, I've left some perspiration on that card. That card lies exposed to the dew, to the moon, to the wind, all Thursday night after 10 o'clock, all day Friday, all Friday night and until Saturday about noon. It's then picked up, it's examined by 2 or 3 people, it's carried to Somerville in a bundle with a lot of other papers, examined, put in a box, carried to New Brunswick, and with that little perspiration that's been put on me on that card, by simply putting down there, that little perspiration has survived all that time so they could develop it into a fingerprint that would send Willie Stevens to the electric chair. I charge with all the solemnity that's involved in that card is a fraud.
Mr. McCarter was just warming up. He went on to discredit the pig woman's testimony from the hospital bed, calling it humbug and a scene meant to influence you as theatrical. Before winding up, the former Attorney General of New Jersey offered up Jim Mills as the killer. He concluded shortly after that assertion.
Think of the situation. A refined lady enjoying a comfortable home, pursuing an ordinary and religious life, loving and, as she supposed, loved by her husband. Suddenly, like a thunderstruck, they'll find out that he's dead. That's pretty bad, isn't it? But in the face of that, to be accused of the murder and to have 2 innocent brothers brought in as co-conspirators of this ruthless murder. It lies with you, gentlemen of the jury, to put an end to this persecution, to free this family from the stigma of this heartless accusation, and to let these law-abiding citizens, these defendants, realize that you, at least, are not of the motley crew who, under the guise of ferreting out crime, are seeking and acquiring wealth and hoping to gain political ascendancy.
May it please the court and gentlemen of the jury. I think at the beginning I should say that our community certainly owes this court a great debt of gratitude for its firmness, and patience, and learning, and courtesy that the court has displayed in this most trying of trials.
Prosecutor Simpson's closing argument went on for several hours. He thanked the jurors for their duty to the community, yet no man ever faced a jury with less regard for what it thought than Simpson. He referenced the potential dislike some of the jurors had toward him because of his Hudson County ties. He also reminded them that they were on trial too, that the whole public of the country is watching them. Senator Simpson also reviewed all of the testimony and squarely placed the murder of Eleanor Mills at the feet of Frances Hall and her brothers. Let's listen as the prosecutor finished up.
What would you expect from the defense defending a murder 4 years and 3 months old, which has already become a stink and a scandal here in the state of New Jersey and over the entire country, so that the New York papers are printing cartoons about the administration of justice in New Jersey? What would you expect but a slimy defense? Who killed these people? Who had a motive to kill these people? Why were they killed? And why was this murder hushed up? That is what you have to solve, gentlemen of the jury. The challenge to you and your oath is, what do you say on the evidence? That is the challenge to you, the big challenge.
The defendants on trial before you are charged by this indictment with having murdered Eleanor Mills in this county of Somerset on the 14th day of September, 1922. Although this trial has lasted for about a month and an enormous amount of oral testimony and documentary evidence has been laid out before you, the fundamental issue of the fact to be determined are extremely simple. The defendants deny having killed Eleanor Mills and having denied anything to do with her killing. The defense is in absolute denial of having done the act directly or indirectly. Hence, your principal inquiry will relate to that issue. To convict any one of the defendants, the state must prove to your satisfaction beyond a reasonable doubt, 1, that Eleanor Mills is dead and was murdered. 2, that such murder took place within the county of Somerset. 3, that each defendant or defendants committed that murder by actually perpetrating the killing or participated therein as a principal. That Eleanor Mills is dead and that she died on September 14th, 1922 seems undisputed, and you should have no difficulty on that score. So if the state, in your estimation on the entire evidence, has failed to prove that Mrs. Hall or Henry Stevens or William Stevens, as the case may be, was there and participated in the killing as principal and not as an innocent bystander, such person as to whom the proofs fails should be acquitted. However, if after such consideration you find that the state has not proved that any one of the defendants on trial fired the fatal shot or shots, all should be acquitted. But if, on the contrary, you find that one of them did fire them, that one should be found guilty of some grade of homicide within the scope of the indictment, murder in the first degree or second degree, or perhaps manslaughter. It will remain to ascertain the guilt or otherwise of the others.
And so it was that after 5 weeks of trial, after a total of 157 witnesses, and after much courtroom drama, the fate of the widow Hall and her 2 brothers lay in the hands of the 12 jurors. The jury was out for 5 hours and 4 minutes. They came back at 6:29 p.m. on Friday, December 3rd, 1926.
Gentlemen, the court will ask you to render your verdict separately as to each defendant, in that you will be asked as to each defendant whether you find that defendant guilty or not guilty. Will the defendants rise? Gentlemen of the jury, have you agreed upon your verdict?
We have.
Mr. Foreman, Ms. Foreman, how do you say you find as to the defendant Henry Stevens guilty or not guilty?
Not guilty.
Ms. Foreman, how do you say you find as to the defendant Mrs. Hall guilty or not guilty?
Not guilty.
Gentlemen of the jury, you have dealt very patiently with a very long case. The court wishes to express its appreciation of the patience and the diligence with which you have handled the matter. You are excused for the term with the thanks of the court.
Your Honor, can I have the jury's verdict on my other client, Willis?
Yes.
Willie Stevens?
Willie Stevens, I apologize, not guilty.
With that, the Hall Mills murder trial came to an end. Dozens of reporters rushed out of the courtroom to send their stories. And that was the end of it. To this day, the vicious murders of Reverend Hall and choir singers Mills remains one of America's greatest unsolved mysteries. Good afternoon.
There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. The trial of the century, the Hall Mills murder trial.